Welcome to Come and See, your podcast for finding truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. With host and founder, Richard Case, and co-host and retreat leader, Kathy Ricconi. Jesus reminds us to watch for the signs of his return. Today, we will explore further what we are seeing in our times that line up with what signs he said would indicate the potential of the end and his return. We will also discuss the practical meaning of this as we watch and as a remnant prepare as he so leads. And now your host, Richard Case.
Good morning, everybody. This is our End Times Friday discussion. This is part 2 with our good friends Eric and Rabbi Ephraim from Jerusalem. They're both in Jerusalem this week. We're getting ready for Thanksgiving here in America, by the way. This is our week. Thursday will be a big celebration for us. We know Israel has many feasts of Thanksgiving, so it's kind of cool to be part of that. But Denny, welcome. It's great having you as a co-host. And I know as we finished our last session, it kind of brought up a thought about some spiritual things. So why don't you go ahead and ask those?
Yeah, the last session, there was this sort of sobering reality about what Israelis expect as the rest of the world is watching for a peace process to just play out. And I had really a question for both of you, but Ephraim, you might be best to start this, about the spiritual mood of Israelis and how Israelis look at what has happened and what is to come related to prayer or Thanksgiving from a spiritual sense, because our audience is very interested and we believe that God is orchestrating all of this, of course. And so I think that'd be helpful for us.
Sure. Okay. Well, Israel has a really, really strong spiritual backbone. And although the country is split, the majority of the country is not what you would call religiously observant, but there is very strong, 20%, maybe it's even 30% that are somewhat observant. And then there's another 20 or 30% who would refer to themselves as being traditional, who observe the holidays and have very traditional values, but aren't strictly observant. But despite that, the whole country has a very, very strong connection to Jewish destiny, being part of the Jewish people, being part of this unbelievable 3,000-year-old story, which is unfolding, and the miracles just don't stop popping up all over us, no matter whether we want them or not. We're just surrounded by miracles. And so I'll give you an example. I was with a group last week and we went to this all-you-can-eat meat restaurant in Jerusalem.
I know which one.
Master, right? So it's there's 150 people probably, all at different tables. And by the end of the evening, everyone in the restaurant is up from their chairs, singing and dancing with everybody else in the restaurant to songs whose words, when you translate, are things like, "The Almighty God loves us all," and "The Jewish people live and will live forever," and "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." This is religious, not religious, black, white, you name it, everyone from across the spectrum, and they're just dancing up and down. And so there's a great unity, there's a great feeling of commonality. It doesn't hurt that most of us feel that a significant portion of the world is against us.
Now, in that regard right there, what prompted them to go and do that together? I mean, what stimulates that?
There's a real joie de vivre in Israel. So they just start playing the music. There's a DJ, he starts playing the music, and everybody is just up, and they're just so happy to be Jewish, to be part of Israel, to be part of this country. People love each other. There's a real sense of happiness that exudes, even with all the difficulty and the suffering. And it's just the way life works here. There's surveys that have been done of different peoples in different countries, and they evaluate how happy they are on a whole scale of everything. And Israel almost always ranks one of the highest countries in happiness, and despite everything that we go through. So and I think that the spirituality, in the sense that, God is with us, whether I'm observant or not observant, but there's a feeling like there's a God who's watching us, and there's a God who is behind the whole Jewish people enterprise. It's something that almost everybody does carry and is proud of and feels a really great connection to.
If I might interject one thing, even among the what's called secular community, these are people who would argue that maybe they would go to a high holiday service on Yom Kippur for an hour or two once a year, and that's the extent of their religious observance. But even in the vast majority of these families, when it comes to Friday evening, it's expected all the children are going to be home, no matter where they are in the country, with their boyfriends, girlfriends, children, grandchildren, all gathered around the Shabbat table. And many, I would say the vast majority of families recite the blessings over the wine, and there's a blessing over the children that comes from the blessing of the high priest derivative, and the phones are off. The phones are off for 2 or 3 hours. And maybe once the meal is over and the dishes are done, the kids are off and driving to go with friends to the beach, or maybe they're going to go to something else. But for a variable amount of time in this country, depending upon your level of religious observance, people stop their lives, turn off the phones, and communicate with each other. And I think that's something very special in the country.
So you would characterize that as a kind of a common spirituality, obviously, because there's a belief in God and like you say, that He's active. Would you, from our perspective, let's say as part of, let's say, a church that we're active in, that would carry over to, times of prayer, seeking God, asking God to do certain things. Does it go to that level where people then actively get together, either individually or corporately, pray? God, would you, or we're asking you to continue to protect us or to guide us. Does that go to that level, or does it kind of stop at the community celebration level?
You're asking on an individual basis, or?
And in both individual and then corporately. In America, we would do that both. We would have times where we would spend, like for example, when we have an election, like a presidential election we had, people of church going to churches, celebrating churches, they would pray individually and they would pray corporately. God, would you put in the person that you want to lead this country, and we'd like to return it to be able to have freedom and religious things, that kind of thing. We would do that on a personal and a corporate level.
Yeah, I think on a personal level, I think that's very common, certainly amongst anyone who's religiously observant, but you wouldn't find it in business. That's what you mean by corporate. We wouldn't find it in businesses or anything. But I would tell you where you would find something similar is music. Like in modern Israeli music, a lot of it is super spiritual. It's the most popular recording artists in this country very often use verses from the Bible as sources for their music. And you open the radio and you hear verses from the Psalms or from Ecclesiastes.
Even the pop music.
The most popular pop music. And everyone's listening to it. Everyone's dancing to it. It doesn't matter if they're religious or not religious. This is just the music. It's spiritual. It's talking about God. It's talking about prayer. It is prayer. And that's just normal over here, which is a really cool thing. I don't think you have that type of phenomena in the United States.
We would typically, for that, as well as any discussion, it would be done on what's called a Christian radio station. That people are specifically expressing that kind of music, that kind of understanding. Right. It wouldn't be typical pop music. It sounds like this for you mainstream. It's kind of universal mainstream. It's interesting.
Yeah. And another thing I think you'll probably find very interesting is that many of the victims of the kidnapping, people that were held in Hamas tunnels for 2 years or a year and a half or however long they were, they're all coming out with stories, which I'm sure do not reach you guys, but they're all coming out with the stories of how spirituality was such an important part of their survival, as well as their parents and their families that were surviving the nightmare of going through it. So many of them turned to different aspects of Jewish traditions. So a lot of the kidnapped victims are talking about that they would do Kiddush. They would do the prayer on Friday night. Even if they didn't have wine, they would take whatever they had, a little piece of pita, they would save it for Friday night, and they would say Kiddush, and they would say prayers. People that never said prayers before in their lives because they were very secular would remember what few prayers that they can remember from their childhood, and that became part of their daily ritual to give them strength to survive. And some of them have become completely observant religiously after getting released. And many of their families have become more religious and more observant as a result of what they've gone through. So you sort of think like, this might do the opposite, but it's really there's a very strong spiritual reconnecting that has happened through these tragedies.
There's a related phenomenon, which I think maybe your listeners would be interested to hear about. It's the beginning of the war. If you go, now, you need to bear in mind, bus systems here in Israel are used by virtually everybody. It's not like in the United States where it's only the segment of society that can't afford to drive or whatever uses them. Here, buses are used by pretty much every segment of society.
In fact, Eric and I bumped into each other on the bus 2 weeks ago.
That's right. And so you go to a normal like bus stop, and sometimes they have billboards nearby where they have events announced and like pastings, and what you'll see are stickers. I don't know about half the size of a bumper sticker, okay, in the United States, and in it it'll have a photograph of some soldier, or maybe it was a hostage who was taken. In the case of a soldier, maybe likely passed away, was killed in action, with something they said that the family wishes the whole country to know that they said. You'll see hundreds of these things plastered, like in the main train station in Tel Aviv. It's like every wall is plastered with these things of. And it's the way the family can perpetuate the memory of the loved one they lost, or they potentially may have lost. And there are so many charitable organizations, some won't last, some will, that are being started up as a way for families to make sense out of the death of somebody they loved during the war, to try to perpetuate their memory. I was at what's called Nazkara, which is 1 year after the death of somebody. There's a memorial service. They do something by the graveside, and sometimes they do something separate. And this was the son of a couple friend of mine who I knew back in Palo Alto when I lived out in California for so many years. And they had moved to Israel as well. And their youngest son was serving in a special forces unit, went in on October 7th with his unit. And he didn't have to go in because he was actually on leave, but he went in and out of his 4 platoon members, he was a medic. 3 of them were killed. He survived, but he was shot 7 times on the 7th. He was in the hospital for over 400 days, survived. In the end, he died. So I was in a yeshiva that's like I don't know what you call it, religious seminary, where it had to be seating for about 300 people, and there were people standing, and there were friends. This kid was like 24 years old, and the lives that he touched was just amazing. How a kid this young could have touched so many people that all wanted to come and say their memories about him and so on, and it was just really something special. And you see that in this country, a lot.
The bumper stickers that Eric's referring to, when they have like a quote that person would say, there are always things that are spiritual or ethical. Like the main thing is to help other people, or live every day as if it's your last, or shine the light of goodness onto everyone else that you meet every day. Like all things of beautiful goodness and spirituality.
One of the American hostages, Gersh Goldberg, it became like all over Israel now what he said. He was encouraging a lot of the fellow hostages that he was encountering when he was underground with them before he was killed. One famous thing he said was, if you bear in mind, this kid must have been 22 years old, not any older. He says, if you have a how, you'll figure out a why. No, if you know why, you'll figure out a how. If you have a why, you'll figure out a how, which is amazing. I mean, for a kid this young.
Has it therefore stimulated more reading of the Torah and the Old Testament in Israel at all? I mean, like again in America, you've heard of the Charlie Kirk assassination. There's been a big spike in what they call Gen Z purchases of Bible apps and Bibles that stimulated reading. Has that been the same in Israel at all?
I would say that there's been a surge of interest and further observance, which is in all areas. It's like keeping the Sabbath more, praying more, putting tefillin, the phylacteries on more, and learning Torah, going to classes, studying the Bible. It's like all those involved. Everyone to different degrees. I don't know if anyone's been like studying the statistics of it, but it's definitely something you hear about in the media all the time.
Yeah.
How about attendance at synagogue, Friday night synagogue?
That's an interesting question. Synagogue is not like, I know that in Christianity there's very much like, are you a church going Christian?
Right.
We don't have that as much because Jewish religiosity is not nearly as based on going to synagogue. Some of the most observant people don't go to synagogue very often. It's more based on keeping the Sabbath and keeping the laws of, kosher and praying on your own with the prayer books and stuff. But it's so I'm sure that there has been some increase in that, but that's less where you see the expression of more spirituality.
Because your community is really more family oriented, right? With the Sabbath, et cetera. It's not necessarily connecting to the synagogue. It's really connected to those events that around the family and the feast, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you look at Netanyahu and him presenting rationale for maintaining the land, for example, not giving up land, does he or the government use that it was given by God as biblical? Does he use any of that argument at all in terms of why they're called not to give up this land and give up this nation?
So for internal consumption within Israel, he doesn't usually, because half of the country, roughly speaking, it's probably a little more than half, already knows that, believes it. We don't have to have the prime minister remind us that God gave us this land.
Okay.
And then the more secular parts, if they don't believe that God gave us the land, it's not really going to do much for them to have the prime minister say it. For external consumption, many of us would like people to bring that up more often. I know they occasionally mention it when they're on, interviews with international media. Netanyahu occasionally does. I think it's a really important part of making the case for Israel, certainly showing our 3,800 year love affair with this country, but I don't think we bring it up enough for external consumption.
For me, it's a very interesting topic, because being a Jew myself and also being a Christian by choice, it's only from my perspective as a Christian, having really read the Bible to understand God's purpose, reading it that way as opposed to ceremonially on week by week, that this idea of Zionism has any real meaning. And because in the United States, the fight, if there's a fight over the logic of where Americans ought to be related to Israel, it comes down to this question of, is Zionism valid? Because that's the place that anti-Semitism has really grown. It's not about that we hate or dislike Jews. We hate the idea of Zionism, and it's all over the Torah, all over. It's so fundamental to the Torah, and that anybody who would read the Bible would understand that that's really the center.
How are you defining Zionism, Denny?
That God has given the land to the Jewish people. It was his promise for a purpose, an eternal purpose. And even to the idea that to the Jewish people, he has handed this responsibility. That's how I read it. Our two Israeli friends are like, quiet.
I think people view it differently. For me, it's placing our destiny in our own hands for the first time in thousands of years. So that's what it's about. I'm much less observant than my wife is, and as well as Ephraim. But for me, my motivation for being here and involved in all this is that I feel like it's a real shame to be Jewish and living in a time when we're able to have the state and to be an observer watching from 3,000 and 10,000 miles away. It's like, I'm not the kind of person that likes to. I've never been to a professional spectator sport in my life. No, excuse me, baseball, excluding the St. Louis Cardinals, which then you will understand.
You are not a Cardinals fan?
No, except for the St. Louis Cardinals.
Okay.
I have never been to a professional sporting event in my life because I just don't enjoy it. I like sort of being in the middle of things, and so this is my way of participating and helping, strengthen the destiny of a people I feel a part of. So, I read, there's the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Rabbi Sachs, who passed away, 4 years ago, Ephraim? I forget.
Yeah.
An amazing writer and thinker. And I've read, I think, most of his books, and I read, every week what he wrote for the weekly interpretation of the Torah portion, because I really relate to a lot of what he writes about. Everyone's a bit different.
Well, I
But
appreciate go ahead.
I was just saying, at its core, Zionism is the belief that the Jewish people have a right to a homeland in their historical land. And you can believe that because God gave it to us. You can believe it because we've had a connection to this land for thousands of years. You can believe it because the United Nations said we should have a country in this land. But it's believing that the Jewish people should have one country of their own in their ancestral homeland.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll pick this up again for our next session. We're going to have a third one coming up. And it's really interesting to talk about that specifically as we relate to what's Trump's doing with Saudi Arabia and the Abraham Accords and this idea of a two-state, quote, solution that seems contradictory a little bit to that. So we're going to talk about it. And particularly both of you over time, we would like to discuss your view and then the Jewish view of the end, which is, in our view of it, is everything centers around Israel completely, and the world comes against it, and then ultimately there's a battle of Armageddon that attempts to eliminate completely Israel, which they're not successful. So we'd like to get your perspective of that as does it have any bearing on how people think and act? Certainly here, which is what we do where we are. Anyway, so thank you so much. I think, Denny, it was a really healthy discussion about that. It's really informative to us, that the dynamic. It's interesting about your spirituality is more fundamental, so to speak, and your community is your families and that spontaneous, so to speak, worship that happened at a restaurant. That's kind of cool to see that. So anyway, thank you guys for doing it. And if you have any questions, audience, we'd love to hear from you. Questions at abideministry.com and send them in, and we'll answer them and we'll process it. We love questions, and Eric and Rabbi are so gracious to be able to take anything we throw at him and give us what the truth is from Israel. So we're so grateful for that. So anyway, thank you so much, Denny. It was good seeing you, and we will again see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Come and See, your podcast for truth in a world of chaos. Brought to you by Living Waters Abide Ministries. Send us your questions and comments, and tune in tomorrow for more answers to your personal questions about living life in God's truth. Remember, God's will is best and none better. His truth brings peace in this world of chaos.